Hey, folks. So we're here with anarchist playwright Brent and Langle, and we are going to react to that debate I just had with Stefan Molyneux. Wow, Brent, what do you think?
Well, first off, may I be the first to congratulate you on your overwhelming win. Yeah. So, Steph, I've wanted a piece of that guy for a few years, but he's a tough opponent, and he's a very tough opponent because he acts in very bad faith. And used a number of like insults, ad hominems, a combination of that to undermine your arguments and to try to continually reframe the debate with some pretty nasty tactics. But he's got like that really nice radio voice that he's cultivated over the years. So a lot of people don't get it because he's got kind of almost a mild-mannered facade. And so he'll say something horrible and incredibly offensive, and like it doesn't sound like he's really like losing his stuff and going after you. But yeah, he was totally losing it there. I thought you really had him pinned down in the fact that he could not answer where is capitalism? Where has capitalism ever existed? And he at no point you didn't like stump him because he's gotten that question before, but you just chased him round and round and round and round, and he never answered that question, and and you didn't let up, which was I think that was the key to your victory right there.
I mean, his argument seemed to boil down to communist regimes have committed atrocities and violated human rights. Well, no shit, Sherlock. You know what I mean? And he tried to then accuse me throughout the debate of supporting violations of human rights and such, which I vehemently said I did not do. And that's all he had. I felt like I said at the beginning of the debate, I've won the debate. He admitted that the fall of the Soviet Union was an economic disaster. He just blamed communists for it. The topic of the debate was the fall of the Soviet Union a good thing? He admitted it was a bad thing. So, yeah. I mean, what were we debating? What did we just spend an hour and a half arguing about? I really don't know. We spent an argument out. I mean, it was weird. What shocked me was the blatant appeal to white nationalism throughout the debate. He accused me of being anti-white, which I refuted. And I am white, for goodness sakes, right? If anyone has a right anti-white, Caleb does. Whiter than sour cream. So, I don't know what that was about.
He was doing this thing. I hear it a lot too. The people on the right, and especially the far right, love to act like people on the left will not condemn Muslims because we obviously love Muslims because we hate white people. Like that's literally their analysis. And I think that was like the sort of trope he was going for with it. It was ridiculous.
It really was. And again, like I feel like I was expecting a much stronger debate. I knew that he has gone on record as a defender of colonialism, but to see him to just throw that under the bus for the convenience of argument, I was like, wow, this is a lot easier than I thought it would be. I was expecting him to talk about the British Empire being great or something like that. And no, they used force, so it's not capitalism. And so we're down to where has capitalism ever existed in the world? Where? Well, he can't point to any example. So what are we really arguing about? It's like, it's like I'm arguing that thing that we can learn from systems that actually existed in the real world. He's arguing that in some hypothetical world, there could be no government and no use of force whatsoever, and that would be better. Well, I guess that would be better, but I don't think the road to it is just complete deregulation. I think that and I admitted throughout, that the goal of communism is a stateless, classless world. It just requires vast material abundance to get there. If you just declared that tomorrow, it would be the law of the jungle. I will say, I did finally cut in. His closing statement went way over 5 minutes.
Yeah. Well, and even that, he was real sneaky too, because they were like, okay, we'll have Steph go and then Caleb goes. And he's like, no, I'd like Caleb to go first. He did that. He did that so he would be the last thing that people heard. So people would give more weight to his argument and he could go on as long as he wanted.
But he still didn't say anything. He proceeded to just say, and Caleb, defends a system that violated human rights. I mean, that's all he's got. I said throughout the debate that it was extremely dishonest on his part to say that I defend the human rights violations. What I thought was interesting was he quibbled about whether slavery was so bad. He quibbled, and then he denied that he quibbled about it. He quibbled about the killing of the Native Americans. If I had quibbled just one bit over Stalin, if I had quibbled just one bit over Mao, the condemnation he would have poured on me would have been massive. It would have been, you're a Holocaust denier. You know,
Yeah.
but he sits there and says, "Well, slavery wasn't so bad. I mean, black people sold other black people. So that makes it okay. Oh, Native Americans, they all died from disease. I mean, he sits there, and I just said, wow. And I knew that he wanted me to get all, he wanted to argue about that. That's what he wants to argue about. That's the weird thing. He really does represent that alt-right, libertarian to alt-right pipeline, because he was really there to argue about white nationalism. He wasn't there to argue about communism versus free markets or whatever.
And I was about to say, by the way, with that, it's almost, Caleb, it's almost as if fascists are incoherent and dishonest. I know that's a crazy thing to bring up.
Right.
Oh.
Right. And it was weird. I predicted in my opening statement what this debate would be, and I said we're going to hear every Solzhenitsyn allegation against the Soviet Union, but that's not an argument. That's what I said in my opening statement. We're arguing about, was the fall of the Soviet Union the demolition of a country that was once prosperous, the free trade imposition on it, was that a good thing? I said, no, it wasn't. And he agreed with me, but it was communists' fault. And then we moved on. And I thought it was also interesting that I pointed out in my opening that the reason Russia's economy started to improve around 1999, 2000 was because Putin got in power and reestablished and reasserted elements of state control. It's not a Marxist country anymore. But it's centered around a government-run oil company, and it's more of a social democratic model than it was in the 1990s when Boris Yeltsin, who was a good friend of Bill Clinton, was there, and they were letting BP loot the place, and Bill Browder and all of that. That's and I think he didn't even know what to do with that. He was just like a deer in the headlights at that point. I think if we could see him, I mean, if we had a his face. Because
he looks like a deer in the headlights a lot, to be fair to him.
The original proposal I'd gotten for the debate was to have a debate, is Russia better off since the fall of the Soviet Union? And I said, no, I don't like that topic, because they are better off. During the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a big, blockade that they weren't allowed to get any computer technology from the West. Well, now they have all kinds of computer technology. They couldn't drink Coca-Cola. They couldn't import any Western products during the time of the Soviet Union. Now they can, I mean, in some ways, in a lot of ways, I would say Russia is better off than the fall of the Soviet Union. Obviously, there are some big differences. There's a lot more poverty now, for example. There's unemployment and stuff. But regardless, I mean, you could make the argument. So I didn't really want to have the debate. I wanted to
well, you find yourself arguing, is the future, like far in the future, better than the past, because technology advances as well, and populations grow, and GDP goes up. I mean, so not only are you arguing about economic systems, but if you'd gone in that direction, you would have been arguing against time, essentially.
Right. I mean, the future is an advance over the past. There are people who don't agree with that, though. There's a lot of traditionalists and conservatives around the world, not in the United States, around the world who would quibble with me there, but I don't think Stefan would have.
I should bring up, by the way, also, I feel like he was desperately trying to keep control of the frame of the debate by pretending ignorance. Like when he was saying, like, I don't know what you're even talking about here. I don't understand. Like, you were speaking very plainly, but what he was doing was he was trying to keep control of it. And he kept like trying to be both the debater and the mod. And this would be like if I was in a freaking sparring match. Like if I was doing like not Kyokushinkai, like if I was doing a knockdown, like I was doing a kumite, and my opponent came in and was beating me up, and I was like, no, you have to not punch like this. Okay, it's really important. Let me show you how to punch. We're gonna do this, and that's not his place, and that would not be my place as the opponent in that. That's what the freaking ref is there to do. I was a little annoyed, by the way, because I felt like the ref was I mean, he was less active than even James had been in the debate with Stryker and Mike.
Yeah, and I had to use my shouting voice a lot more, unfortunately, because of that. And that's not a good look for me or anybody else when you shout like that. But I'm sorry. I mean, he was at one point, I simply asked, why do libertarians lie about, social, and he like flipped out. You're calling me a liar. I said, are you going to let me talk? I didn't call him a liar. I said libertarians. I mean, he doesn't represent all libertarians, and I mean, he lost his shit at that point.
That was a very nice way of framing that question too, because he can clarify his position. It's not an attack. I think honestly, StephBot has a very, very fragile ego that he manages to conceal just barely. And it comes through in the surface when he will interpret statements in a debate as attacks on him when they're really not. They're just statements in a debate, but like he's got a very, very thin skin, but he hides it very well unless you know what you're looking for.
Yeah. I will say that, I was listening to his closing statement and I was like, when is this going to end? I want to get this on YouTube. I mean, it's uploading to WeTransfer now. I got to get the audio file up there and all of this. I was listening to his closing statement and it's like he goes on this tirade about spanking. Like,
yeah.
Okay. What? I'm sitting there going, what? What the hell? I mean, it's like we're talking about, he reiterates communism killed millions of people. And sure, maybe real capitalism hasn't ever been tried. Spanking. I'm just like, what the hell is this man talking about?
I think he's got some really serious issues, to tell you the truth, like some really serious personal issues. He's, and I don't want to mock him for that. I mean, we've all got stuff we got to deal with, but yeah, a lot of his cult is based on like, he did the anarcho-capitalist to white nationalist pipeline. And the anarcho-capitalists have this very ridiculous, and I shouldn't even say anarcho because they're not anarchists. Like Stephen's like, I'm an anarchist. No, he's not. Oh, by the way, I'm still mad at you for the ANCOM, for throwing the ANCOMs under the bus. That's all right. I understand. It's a common argument made by ANCOM, so it's reasonable to make that argument. I like to think I make a much more sophisticated version of it. Yeah, so like they will do this thing where they're like, okay, we'll have a completely voluntary society, no force except defensive force. And they don't realize that what is and is not defensive force is a matter of opinion. So they'll say NAP, and what happens is that in practice, the stronger party of the two always wins, because both parties genuinely believe that they are just defending themselves when they're attacking the other party quite frequently. I mean, Israel and Gaza, great example. Both parties claimed self-defense. Both are even right, but guess which one is in control and wins that argument? It's the stronger party, which at the moment is Israel. So like the non-spanking, it's like him getting beat up as a kid, assuming that happened, led into his adoption of this idiotic non-aggression principle idea. And then that leads into his argument, his criticism of the state and what he puts forward as capitalism, and he defines it in purely negative terms. It's a lack of coercion. But of course, he doesn't even realize that private property is coercive in and of itself, that these economic conditions that he praises and puts at the feet of capitalism, all of that is there because the government created a situation where they could be there by invoking force. And you brought that up, with regard to the British Empire. I would have liked to have heard you mention the Enclosure Acts and in Britain and the Homestead Acts in the United States. But all in all, like basically it's like he's got this mental idea of capitalism that has never existed, that can't exist, and he doesn't equate it with the state because of Cold War propaganda and because he hasn't really thought about this in a deep way.
Well, I mean, it's weird. Again, his tactic was to just completely throw everything on his side under the bus. No real capitalism. Yeah, British colonialism involved force. He doesn't do that on his radio show. And you'll notice that even in this debate, even though he denounced it all, he still feels it's like his duty to defend Western colonialism and imperialism. And then that's odd. I must say it's odd because there's nothing more British Empire than spanking. I mean, I'm sorry. There's a reason that in Singapore they still have public canings on the buttocks. That's because of British colonialism, right? I mean, you look at it. I mean, that was like
big part of British schooling was beating children with. If you watch, what's that? The Dursleys not the Dursleys. That's the Harry Potter thing. The Durrells in Corfu, about the British family that goes to live in Greece. It's a good show to watch with your parents. It's on PBS. But like that whole thing starts when the mother pulls the younger kid out of school because the British headmaster caned him.
Yeah, I mean that's a big part of, when they were going to developing countries and trying to quote unquote civilize the people with brute force, they imposed corporal punishment on adults and children in very brutal ways. I mean that's so I'm not fault, but I guess it's because it involved force. It's not really capitalism, and no society in history, except for maybe hunter-gatherer situation, which he thinks doesn't exist, right? Hunter-gatherer civilization never happened because Native Americans in the 1880s owned slaves. So,
yeah, which is well after the development of freaking settled agriculture.
that was just weird when I heard him deny hunter-gatherer civilization. That was just like, I'm sorry, but it's like, what? And he's like, oh, I just did a presentation on this. I'm like, huh? And then he said, yeah.
It's completely false. Like if you read David Graeber's Debt, the first 5,000 years, he has the proof in that book that like, I'm sure individual acts of slavery may have existed before that, but like a slave economy and like slavery, like there is a direct relationship between coined currency, slavery, and wars of conquest with regard to the state. You had states develop to protect, to secure and defend the resources in a settled agricultural economy. These states, the peasants paid their taxes through agriculture, but it was measured in silver, which then created the impetus to mine silver and create coins, which then could be used to pay professional armies to go and capture more slaves and bring them back to mine more silver, to pay for more armies, to mine more silver, to, and so like you have this triangular relationship where wars of conquest in the state, metal coinage, and slavery, like slavery as an economic system, all depend on each other and developed more or less around the same time. And that was what you were trying to bring up, and he was trying to go after the fact that supposedly some Native American tribes had kept slaves. It's ridiculous.
Well, and what's odd about that is, Marx distinguishes between the practice of human chattel slavery and the economic order known as slavery, right? Mm-hmm. There's a difference, right? Slavery existed in the United States when the United States was capitalist, right? It was production for profit. They were selling, products, exporting them to make profits, but they were using slave labor to do it in the South. That was capitalism with slavery, which is a hangover from feudalism. But the epoch of slavery, like the Roman Empire, that's when you basically had production only for consumption, right? When, you had a landowner who had a plantation and owned a bunch of people, and they produced for his needs, right? For the needs of the household, right? And that the Roman Empire depended on slavery, but it was not exporting products. It was capitalist mode of production with the, fact that people were being owned in the process. And there's a difference, right? The Roman Empire, Greece, this was a different mode of production.
And also the slaves, if I'm not mistaken, the slaves in the Roman Empire had a lot more rights than, like, when you use the phrase chattel slavery. Like American chattel slavery was really kind of one of the cruelest forms that slavery has ever taken. Because, for instance, the children of a slave in the Roman Empire would not be slaves, and it wasn't based on race or specific peoples. It was people who had lost a war or who had fallen into debt or for one other thing, which is monstrous, but not the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, American slavery was basically factory farm production where the factory owner owns the workers. That's basically what it was. And many people that are defenders of the South and the neo-Confederate folks will try to say, well, slavery was going to go away anyway because it was inefficient, blah, 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 blah. And what they fail to recognize is, yes, slavery was inefficient, but abolishing slavery would have meant all the slave holders giving up millions of dollars worth of their property, which they weren't going to do without a fight. And towards the end of slavery in the United States, we saw barbarous, awful things that were insane, like we saw in southern cities like Atlanta, Georgia, Montgomery, Alabama, and elsewhere, the slave owners trying to keep up with the northern industrial capitalists by setting up factories in which their human property would work. But they wouldn't pay them a wage, obviously. They would just threaten them with a beating if they didn't work hard enough, right? We saw the slave owners were trying their hardest. They were desperately trying on their hardest to keep slavery. That's why the Civil War was necessary. W.E.B. Du Bois talks about this. I mean, I talked about Russia's role in holding back the British Empire. And I mean, I had a lot more. It's interesting. He threw Adam Smith and the British Empire under the bus. I wanted to talk about Adam Smith. I was ready to talk about Adam Smith because, I haven't actually watched the show, but there's a show called Outlander that's very popular these days. Have you watched?
I have.
Yeah.
The first season is interesting. It gradually gets crazier from there, and there are a lot of. I mean, it's basically like a historical fiction romance sci-fi novel, and so like, and I have a feeling that the writer would really like. I feel like they would have been like a goth in a bondage club or something under other circumstances, but because they didn't grow up around those people or in that time, they instead wrote Outlander.
Well, I mean, the thing is, I understand that this Outlander show takes place during the Jacobite uprising in Scotland.
Just before.
Okay. Because Adam Smith, he was studying at Oxford. He was a Scotsman at Oxford during the Jacobite uprising. What that was basically, the Highlands of Scotland, most people were Roman Catholic. London, the British monarchy was Protestant at that point. And they were transitioning to capitalism. They'd already cleared the commons and such in England. Oxford was this very prestigious university. Adam Smith is studying there. And then the Highlanders of Scotland revolted against capitalism, against the trying to preserve feudalism with the support of France and the Catholic Church. They tried to put Bonnie Prince Charlie on the throne to become the king, to replace the monarchy, right, and to become the new monarch, right, arguing he was the rightful king. And he was pro-Catholic, right? And he would stop the clearing of the commons. It was a defensive measure. All these people that were going to get kicked off their land and all of that, they rose up basically to try and defend the feudal commons, stop the enclosure movement that was taking place. I mean, it was reactionary in a way. It was trying to preserve feudalism, but it was done on a kind of a self-defense mode by the Scottish Highlanders. It failed. It was put down. And you have to think of poor Adam Smith, right? Because I mean, Scottish people in England today face discrimination. They're considered to be stingy and untrustworthy and dirty and working class. Imagine being a Scotsman way back then during the Jacobite uprising. Wouldn't have been pleasant, right? So after the uprising is over, Adam Smith has finished his education. He goes to Glasgow and is helping to incorporate Glasgow into the British free trade system. And that's where he writes his book, The Wealth of Nations. And what is the phrase he repeats throughout The Wealth of Nations over and over again? The civilizing influence of commerce. And if you read between the lines in Adam Smith, he sees his own people as a bunch of barbarians. And they're a bunch of barbarians
being civilized by commerce. Which,
And it's self-hating. And what was going on at that point? Glasgow had joined with free trade. It was Presbyterian. What was going on? A genocide was taking place in the Highlands. Millions of people were killed, driven off the land. It was brutal. And there's a lot of traditional folk songs that were written at that time. Like you go to Appalachia, there's all kinds of songs about Bonnie Prince Charlie, over the river to feed my sheep, over the river Charlie. It's about that. The reason Southerners in the United States, not the aristocratic ones who owned the slaves, but low-income Southerners tend to have Scottish last names is because of the fact that they were driven off their land and forced to flee to the United States. So a genocide is taking place against his own people. And he's agreeing with the people committing the genocide and writing a book like, my people are savages. They don't understand the civilizing influence of commerce. Adam Smith is a real head case, really. I mean, seriously, right? And the invisible hand of God, the free market, just naturally fixes everything. I mean, Adam Smith, his ideas have killed millions of people. Free trade has killed millions of people, and no one talks about it. And I went over that in the debate. Did you find that particularly strong when I went over the famines of capitalism?
Yeah, I did, and I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm glad you brought up like the Bengal famine, and I was waiting for you to drop that the British East India Company starved 10% of the Indian subcontinent to death in a single year. I didn't hear that, but you did point out some other famines, and that makes sense because like they didn't actually give a detailed death toll. They're just like 10%, 1 in 10 died.
Figures in Ireland during the Great Famine. As well, the Whig Party imposed free markets, started land seizures, and
somehow here's the issue, and I think this is something. If I ever wind up tangling with Steph Bott, I want to ask him about, because I noticed that the right libertarians and Stefan, they have this very specific notion of what coercion is. And coercion is when I put a gun directly to your head, offensively, not defensively, put a gun directly to your head and say, do it or I'll shoot you.
Yeah.
What they don't seem to understand is that you can coerce someone just as surely by putting a gun to their head as by controlling by controlling their environment to where they are forced into making the choice that you want them to make. You know, it's like if you play a video game and the game purports to be like open world and the character can do whatever they want, but like you try to go off the main quest line of it, like at the beginning of Fallout 4, and like you don't want to go to the bomb shelter, and the game will still force you to make the choice to go to the bomb shelter. It does not allow you any other choices. So then, but they'll say, "Oh, but you freely chose to do that." Another way I'll sometimes explain it is like, okay, you're on a cliff hanging by a rope, and below you is a canyon. And on the other end of the rope, there's a guy that's got the other end of the rope, and he says, "Give me your watch or I drop you." Has that man robbed you? Or did you voluntarily give him your watch? And I and some of them bite the bullet and go, "No, I could choose to fall and die." Okay, whatever. And then others will say, "Well, it's my fault for getting on the cliff." And then you just say, "Oh, by the way, you were born on the cliff. You were born holding onto that rope. Welcome to capitalism."
No, I mean, I was shocked. I've heard him, pull out some real amazing statements in previous debates. I listened to a lot of his stuff in the lead up to it. I heard him at one point argue that that minimum wage laws are not necessary because if you don't like the pay, just get another job. I mean, that's and libertarians will say stuff like that, and it's like anyone who ever worked a low wage job knows you didn't work it because you're just too stupid to get a higher wage. I mean, it's just like there's an element of class privilege and being out of touch with some of the statements that he makes. But yeah, I mean, overwhelmingly, it was weird because it was almost like he didn't hear me in the opening statement say, "We're about to hear nothing but, all kinds of allegations against the Soviet Union." And that's, as Stefan says, not an argument. And then he proceeded to make all kinds of wild allegations. And that kind of set the tone for the debate.
I think he was trying to defeat you as a person and as a personality. He threw in a lot of insults, a lot of ad homs, both some ad hominem, like actual ad hominem arguments, and then some ad hominems by implication, where he would talk about communists and stuff. Here's my question to you, because do you feel like at any point in the debate, like he was specifically trying to recruit for white nationalists? Like, for instance, Eric Stryker and Enoch were, how JF tried to sneak that stuff into the debate? Or do you feel like it was just him kind of going in that direction because he didn't really he didn't really have anywhere else to go?
I mean, he expected me to get triggered and start to quibble with him about some of that stuff that he said. And the thing is, I feel like more of what he was doing was beating his chest to an audience that consists of white nationalists and more blatant white nationalists than himself, and throwing in that I'm anti-white, things like that. He was trying to impress them. It's something that people, I mean, of course, I'm not equating him with Hitler by any means. I mean, he's a guy on the internet. Hitler was a mass murdering dictator. But
I will say, though, if Hitler was alive today, he would be all over social media. He'd be a Redditor.
But I mean, one thing that they said about Hitler is that that in a lot of ways Hitler didn't rule the crowd ruled Hitler, right? He would say something and the crowd would maybe applaud a little bit. He wouldn't repeat that, but he would say another thing and the crowd would go, and he would repeat it. And that a lot of times fascism is finding the worst and most primitive barbaric elements that already exist within the population and just really appealing to them, right?
Amplifying them.
Yeah, and that was what he was doing, right? He's got a racist audience, right? He's ideologically libertarian, but he knows that when he starts to play this idea that white people are the victims of this cruel white-hating left that's going to commit white genocide, and he knows that's a crowd pleaser among his fans, and that's many people who've observed him over the years have noted that he started out a little more doctrinaire libertarian and got into this racism stuff because it sold tickets, because that's the way the wind was blowing. Because at this point, and I wanted to say this. I mean, again, he threw it all under the bus, so I didn't have the opportunity to. I could just ridicule him for throwing it under the bus, but the opposition to the civil rights movement in the United States was led by libertarians and was making libertarian arguments, right? The John Birch Society Look at the White Citizens Council. They sounded just like him. It's a violation of my rights. Why does the federal government have to tell me what my store is? This is communist conspiracy. Civil rights. The Civil Rights Act is communism. It's led by communists. Communists have killed millions of people. There's Communist March for Civil. It's the same shit. It's the same shit, right?
Yeah.
The signs. Look at the signs of these people. Race mixing is communism. This appeal to private property above all else. Private property above racial equality. Right? That was textbook. That was the opposition to the civil rights movement. Now, I guess, what existed, those folks weren't real capitalism because capitalism has never existed anywhere in the world. So I couldn't play that card against him.
Yeah. But of course, in his debate with Vouch, he was going on and on about all the achievements of capitalism. Like you look anywhere and he's constantly praising capitalism, even though it doesn't exist. So, it exists when he wants it to exist, and then it doesn't exist whenever it does something bad. Yeah. that can be traced to it. I feel like, again, like he's doing this thing where he's isolating a part of the system that he likes and assuming that it's its own thing in a vacuum and can somehow be removed from the apparatus of the state structure. And the fact is, property is theft. John Locke, famously said the great and chief end to men uniting into commonwealths was the protection of their property, which the state of nature left very much wanting. He talks about that in his second treatise on civil government. Heck, Adam Smith, civil government, as far as it is instituted for the protection of property, is in reality instituted for the protection of the rich against the poor, which is to say the people who have some property against those who have none at all. And it's like he's got this is one of the things that drives me crazy about right-wing libertarians, because they steal a lot of terminology and a lot of arguments from the anarchists, and then they go off on this like tear with it where I don't even know. It's like they have a blind spot for the state, even though they claim to hate it so much. When, by the way, in reality, they don't actually hate the state. What they hate is democratic government.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. In my conclusion, I talked about how one of the problems in the United States is that we have all these corporations that make profits from things getting worse, right? I talked about the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex, our roads fading and all of that. And it was tempting to say it, but I figured, why bother? He's one of those, right? Because he's really turned the fact that so many young people, young men, young white men in particular in the United States right now, are really facing a big identity crisis, have big emotional problems, have issues with their families, and feel like they don't fit into society. He's basically turned the tragedy of millennials and boomers and the economic realities and the existentialism and all the problems created by capitalism. Instead of trying to fix that, he's turned that into a moneymaker. He gives these people the Freudian, fatherly, affectionate voice that they want, and he profits from their suffering. And when he, actively encourages people, to defoo, as he calls it, right, to cut off their FOO, their family of origin, right, and become more lonely and just become more dependent on his little voice telling them what they want to hear. He's actively profiting off of the decline of the civilization he claims to champion, or I guess he doesn't. He's
always had an issue with ethics. I sent you that podcast, the QAnon Anonymous one. If you got a chance to listen, did you get to the part where his wife was a therapist, and he was hiding in the vent listening in on the therapy conversations, and then occasionally shouting from the vent like his own perspective to the person who's being psychoanalyzed?
Well, what I'm shocked about, first of all, is that one would be so unethical to do such a thing, number one. Yeah, but then, number two, that somebody doing such an unethical thing would have so little self-control in the process. That's kind of a shocking anecdote if I've ever heard it.
Absolutely. You just hear him there like hiding in the vent like freaking Gollum, like, not an argument. Subscribe to Free Domain Radio.
It's like I almost want to forgive him for interrupting me so much. If he has that little self-control that when he's hiding and eavesdropping on people in huge violations of ethics, that he can't refrain from shouting out, at that point, I don't blame him for interrupting me. This guy's got some self-control problems if there ever were such a thing. But yeah, I'm glad I did the debate. If I could do it again, I'd be a little calmer. But unfortunately, from the get-go, I was being interrupted, and it got uglier than I would have wanted. I had a little more of an angrier voice than I would have wanted. That gave him a little bit of an edge. But then again, you know, facts needed to be said, and you know, when you're dealing with the devil, you get loud sometimes, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I kind of had to do similar stuff with JF, and the fact is, when they're saying really disgusting things, you know, it, you can remain calm, but there is a level of, I think, righteous anger or just, you know, exasperation when you're dealing with a person like that. Um, there was something that I wanted to bring up also. He keeps doing this thing, and again, like it would have been nice to see a nail him to the wall for this, but then again, it might have been a distraction, because I thought you actually did a really good job of honing in and controlling the conversation and getting your message out there, as opposed to responding to every little thing he said that was wrong. But profit, when it's make more than spend, like that, and you actually did talk about this in a roundabout way, that wasn't what you, but like, that's not profit in an economic sense, and that's not the capitalist economy does not respond to workers that make more than they spend. That's not considered profit. Profit is specifically once all of the expenses have been paid, what then gets paid to the investors. I mean, like, it's capitalism runs on speculation, investment, and loss, and that's what drives all of the machinery. So a profit-guided economy is not an economy that's guided by people being better off after they've done work than they otherwise would. It's people making money on speculative investments. And I feel like he jumps between the colloquial definition of profit and the economic definition of profit and pretends one is the other in order to make arguments for capitalism. And it's ridiculous.
Indeed. It is, and I'm just glad I'm done with that. You know, it was weird. I really tried my hardest to be as calm as I possibly could during that debate, and you could tell how hard that was. My wife made me a nice cup of tea, which I drank, and I drank my cup of tea, and I just sat there and did it, and I'm glad. I feel like I've been cleansed. You know what I mean? I feel like,
Yeah.
it was like I had an infection in the lead up to this debate. Like, I'm gonna have to talk to Molyneux, you know, and my stomach was. And now I feel great. I got that out of my system. I've de-Molyneuxed, you know, and I'm ready to move on. And yeah, all right. Well, it's always a pleasure to interact with you, Brent. You're doing great on modern day debates, arguing around ethics and Buddhism and all kinds of different stuff. I look forward to continuing your great work. We should probably have another chat sometime about science fiction movies or politics or fantasy or something. Because the viewers really like you. The YouTube channel comments are really positive about you. Every time I have you on the channel, you're a big fan. And Snow White Zombie Apocalypse, I know, is on the shelves, right? I mean, Volume 2 is in the works, right?
Yeah, so Volume 2, I will be releasing the digital copy of it very soon. I've actually sent it to Scout, and they're you know, doing all of the managing ed stuff to take the files and put them into a comic book. That should be out soon. The physical copy will be sent out to the backers on my Kickstarter, or if anybody wants one, they can directly contact me and pay for it, and I'll mail it to them. And then hopefully it will be hitting stores soon. I'm waiting to see when Scout wants to do that, because COVID has shut down Diamond, which has a total monopoly over all comic book shipping in the United States to comic book shops. There are ways to get around it that have been built in the meantime, but until Diamond comes up, there may be a more limited ability to get it. But we'll get that figured out. Two things I did want to mention before we left, though.
Sure.
Well,
go ahead.
Three. So first one, he made the same mistake Vaush did with fascism, where he defined fascism as corporations controlling the government, which is not fascism. It's not what corporatism means. Look up corporatism on Wikipedia. The other thing I loved that you ended with not an argument. After that was really funny. And the group chat, like, everybody was like, "My God, why is this man always talking about rape?" Yeah, but then the final thing is, I have a debate coming up, I believe this Sunday on Modern Day Debate. It's going to be in the day around 2 p.m., so we'll see if I'm up and I've had my coffee enough, because I'm a night owl. But that one will be socialism versus capitalism. It'll be a four-way. We'll have an actually educated ANCAP that I've argued with for years, so it should be an interesting debate, and I'm really looking forward to it, so hopefully your audience will check it out as well.
Absolutely. All right. Well, best wishes, Brent. Always glad to consult with you. Maybe we'll do a follow-up after that debate you got on Sunday. That would be fun. Right?
Sounds like a blast. Love to.
All right. Talk to you soon. All right.
Absolutely. Bye.
Yep. Bye-bye.